This is the final lecture in this series, and it will cover the presidencies of George W. Bush and President Barack Obama. And it will be divided into 4 parts. The first part will look at the war on terror, and primarily focus on 9/11 and the ramifications of that. Now, the story of 9/11 is fairly well known. Shortly after takeoff on the morning of September 11th, 2001, teams of hijackers from the Islamist terrorist group known as Al-Qaeda seized control of 4 American airliners. 2 were flown into the World Trade Center complex, and less than 2 hours later, heat from the crash and an explosion of jet fuel caused the upper floors of the building to collapse onto the lower floors and reduced both buildings to rubble. Now, the passengers of both planes and the crew, as well as 2,606 people in the buildings and 343 New York fighter fighters were killed in the attack. And the 3rd plane was ultimately flown into the Pentagon building in North Virginia, and the 4th crashed near Shanksville, Pennsylvania, when passengers aware of the other attacks attempted to storm the cockpit, and everyone died there as well. Now, this was ultimately the first major event in the presidency of George W. Bush, who came to power in a very close election in the year 2000. And it's noteworthy that immediately after the attack, President Bush promised that those responsible would be brought to justice, and 3 years later, Congress issued a joint resolution authorizing the president to use all means necessary to bring those responsible to justice. On September 20th, 9 days after the attack, President Bush declared war on terrorism. He blamed mainly Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden for the attacks, and he also demanded justice for the radical Islamic fundamentalists who ruled Afghanistan, known as the Taliban, and ordered them to take over or to turn over Osama bin Laden or face attack by the United States. Now, the speech which he made after the September 11th attacks encapsulated what was known as the Bush Doctrine, and you have that on the slide in front of you. Essentially, the Bush Doctrine was the belief that the U.S. has the right to protect itself from terrorist acts by engaging in preemptive wars or ousting hostile governments in favor of friendly and preferably democratic regimes. And this would come to dominate the 8 years that George W. Bush was the President of the United States. Now, it's noteworthy that President Bush did not act alone. In fact, after the attacks, the world leaders throughout most of the world supported Bush. And the ultimate ramification of this was that the Taliban obviously did not hand over Osama bin Laden. So the United States declared war on Afghanistan. And shortly thereafter, they also declared war on Iraq. The tensions between Iraq and the United States had grown in the years since Desert Storm. And there also been an increased worry over the presence of weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, which ultimately were the basis for invading Iraq. Now, here is soldiers at the Helmand province in Afghanistan at the beginning of the Afghani campaign. And here's President Bush after the capture of Baghdad. Now, apart from the war on terror, another significant point that dominated George W. Bush's presidency was the idea of domestic security to prevent anything like 9/11 from ever happening again. And to protect domestic affairs, Bush created what was known as the Office of Homeland Security. in October 2001. The next year, in 2002, Congress passed what was known as the Homeland Security Act, and under the Homeland Security Act, it created the Department of Homeland Security, which basically centralized control over different government functions to better control threats at home. Bush also passed what was known as the United States of America Patriot Act through Congress in the same year, which enabled law enforcement agencies to monitor citizens' emails, telephone conversations, etc. without a warrant. And this was the first step in U.S. history in which such an action was made. Now, it's noteworthy that in the weeks after the attack, the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, scoured the globe and basically swept up thousands of young Muslim men in the wake of the September 11th attacks. Since the United States law prohibited the use of torture, the CIA transferred some of these individuals to other nations, and this practice was known as rendition or extraordinary rendition. Essentially, they did this because local authorities could use methods of interrogation which were not allowed in the U.S., such as forms of torture, etc. Now, while the CIA operated overseas, the FBI also carried out a variety of activities. Some activities were limited by the Fourth Amendment, such as protecting citizens against unreasonable search and seizure. However, in 2002, the Bush administration implemented a wide range of warrantless domestic wiretapping, known as the Terrorist Surveillance Program, and this was carried out by the National Security Agency, or the NSA, as it is better known. Now, this ultimately brings us to the terrorists themselves and what the United States did with these individuals. Now, ultimately, the United States began transporting men suspected of being members of Al-Qaeda to the U.S. naval base at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and they transported them there for questioning. Now, the Bush administration labeled the detainees at Guantanamo as unlawful combatants in an effort to avoid giving them rights guaranteed to prisoners of war, such as protection from torture, and other elements which were prohibited by treaties such as the Geneva Convention. Now, the Justice Department ultimately argued that prisoners would be unable to sue for rights in the U.S. courts on the grounds that the Constitution did not apply to U.S. territories. And this is the reason that they were allowed to do these things in Guantanamo Bay, such as waterboarding, etc. And only in 2006 did the Supreme Court rule in the Hammond versus Rumsfeld case that the military tribunals that had tried Guantanamo prisoners violated U.S. federal law and the Geneva Conventions. Ultimately, in the same year, in August 2006, a federal judge in Detroit also ordered the Freedom Act, which allowed people to wiretap phones, to be ended immediately based on its shaky constitutionality. So 2006 was an important year in the reversal of many of the elements that the Bush administration used to combat the war on terror. Now here is a picture. The right picture is from Abu Ghraib, where prisoners were forced to do various things in order to extract information from them. And the picture on the left is from Guantanamo Bay. Now this brings us to the second part of the lecture. namely economy and society during the Bush administration. This was another important element of the Bush administration, apart from the war on terror and the September 11th attacks. And it's noteworthy that President Bush, much like President Reagan from the other lecture that you heard this week, adopted supply-side economics, namely that if you make tax breaks on the very rich, the idea is that this will stimulate job creation because they invest their money in new industries, which creates jobs. And it's noteworthy that in 2001, the same year that the September 11th attacks happened, Bush and the Republicans in Congress pushed through a $1.35 trillion tax cut, and they lowered taxes across the board, but the largest tax cuts were reserved for the richest people in America. And it's noteworthy that the tax cuts were controversial primarily because it really broadened the gap between the rich and the poor. Now, it's noteworthy that during the presidency of George W. Bush, and even before George W. Bush, the education gap had also widened between the students in the United States and the students in the world. And President Bush took actions to lower this gap and to reduce this gap. And he actually touted himself at the beginning of his presidency as the education president, who sought to introduce reforms to close the educational gaps. And this was one of the big successes that George W. Bush had in his presidency. Now, in order to close the gap, he introduced two main solutions. The first one was the No Child Left Behind Act, which was introduced in January 2002. And basically what this was a system of testing to measure and improve student performance in reading and math at every school who received federal funds. Now basically this would put pressure on the schools to improve the quality of their education, and if poor performance continued at these schools, the schools could be faced changes in their curricula, for example. They could face changes in the teachers that they had, or they could even face closure under the strictest rules of the No Child Left Behind Act. So this put a lot of pressure on schools to increase the quality of the education, particularly in reading and math, which were weak points among U.S. students, especially when you compare them with students abroad. Now, the second reform that George W. Bush instituted was giving students the opportunity to attend schools with better performance record. In other words, students were not restricted to schools within their particular district or within the district in which their parents live. They could now transfer to other schools with better academic records. Some of these schools might be, for example, charter schools. Charter schools were funded by tax money, but were able to accept private donations, and they were also exempt from rules that some public schools might have to follow, which allowed them to implement or to have different varieties of teaching methods, which were supposed to increase the level of education that students received. George W. Bush also encouraged states to grant educational funding vouchers to parents who could use them to pay for private education if they chose to do this. And these vouchers were funded by tax revenue, which otherwise would have gone to public schools. So that's a slightly dark side of this second reform. Nevertheless, it did create greater opportunities for students throughout the United States. Now here is the signing of the No Child Left Behind Act, and you notice that it's George W. Bush is in the foreground. However, you also have both Republicans and presidents. It's noteworthy that in the middle of this is the Senator Kennedy, who was a renowned Democrat and died recently. Now, Bush won the re-election in 2004 despite unpopularity which resulted from the Iraq War and the overstatement that the reason for the Iraq War was the weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. And it's also noteworthy that Republicans gained power in Congress in the 2004 elections as well, both in the House and in the Senate. And following his re-election, Bush said, "I earned capital in this campaign, political capital, and now I intend to spend it." And you have this quote on the slide on your screen. Now, the political capital, or the capital which he spent during this second term, were a variety of policies, including the privatization of Social Security, or the partial privatization of Social Security. He also put new limits on court-awarded damages in medical malpractice suits. And in foreign affairs, he also promised that the U.S. would work towards ending tyranny in the world. However, ultimately, he achieved very few of his second-term goals. Instead, his second term in office was really associated with the challenge of attempting to pacify outbreaks of violence in Iraq, the failure of the Homeland Security apparatus, which we'll talk about more in a minute, during Hurricane Katrina, and one of the most severe economic crises that the United States ever faced since the Great Depression, which emerged during his second term as president, and continues to affect the world economy today to some extent. Now, as mentioned before, one of the biggest failures in terms of the Homeland Security apparatus that President Bush had during this period was the hurricane known as Katrina. And this event was also an event which highlighted the nation's economic inequality and the racial divisions which still existed in the United States, despite the advances which were made during the civil rights era. Now, on August 29th, 2005, Hurricane Katrina came ashore and really devastated the coastal stretches of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. However, New Orleans suffered the heaviest damage when levees, which were embankments designed to protect against flooding in the region, failed. Now, it's noteworthy that New Orleans is actually built below sea level and is held together by these levees much in the same way that the Netherlands is in Europe. Now, the Army Corps of Engineers had warned that this might happen in the event of a large hurricane, but ultimately the warnings were not heeded, and the flooding caused by Hurricane Katrina killed 1,500 people, and tens of thousands of people were trapped on top of their roofs or in other locations and unable to evacuate once flooding started. Now, thousands who were elderly, ill, or too poor to own a car followed the mayor's directions and sought refuge at the Superdome, which is the athletic arena in New Orleans where the New Orleans Saints play. However, ultimately, at the Superdome, they lacked adequate food, water, and sanitation, and this was a big tragedy in the event. Now, ultimately, the United States Coast Guard rescued 35,000 people, but response by other federal bodies was less effective. One such federal body was the Federal Emergency Management Association, which was better known as FEMA, and it really proved to be very inept during this crisis. Some argued after the crisis that the director of FEMA, who was Michael D. Brown, was a friend of George W. Bush as well, and they argued that he really had no qualifications for the post, and this was one of the reasons that FEMA failed. And basically they blamed the appointment of Michael D. Brown and ultimately the failure of FEMA on cronyism in Washington, D.C. And they basically said this was an example of cronyism at its worst, very similar to the politics of the late 19th century, which we discussed in a much earlier lecture. Now, whether or not that is the case or not, everyone got the blame for Hurricane Katrina, Bush included, who, as mentioned before, had made Homeland Security, whether this be from terrorism or natural events, a top priority during his administration. And by 2006, George W. Bush's popularity really reached a new low in America, and this resulted from two things. First of all, the war in Iraq and the hurricane, plus the wealthy first economics, which we discussed previously. Now, ultimately, this resulted in the Democrats gaining control of the Senate and the House for the first time since 1994. And they did this in the 2006 midterm elections. It's also noteworthy that in 2007, Nancy Pelosi became the first female Speaker of the House in the nation's history. So we also have another noteworthy advancement made by women in politics in the United States in 2007. Now here is a picture of houses submerged by water in New Orleans. And this ultimately brings us to another tragedy or another crisis which George W. Bush faced during his presidency, namely the Great Recession of 2008. Now, the backgrounds of the Great Recession, or the origins of the Great Recession, really boil down to what happened in the early 2000s. Now, in the early 2000s, outsourcing in management jobs became common in China and India, and which basically took away jobs in the US market. And there were also a number of corporate scandals during this period. For example, the Houston-based company known as Enron, which was an energy trader, imploded in 2003 due to massive accounting fraud. And the top executives of Enron, who were named Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling, ultimately were awarded very long-term prison sentences as a result of this. Another corporate scandal was when the CEO of the communications company WorldCom inflated the company's assets by $11 billion. And this was the largest accounting scandal in the nation's history. And so in the early 2000s, as a result of the leniency which the Bush administration was giving to companies and the deregulation which the Reagan administration and other presidential bodies had given to large companies, they were starting to use this to their advantage and engaging in corrupt schemes which hurt the US economy. Now, ultimately, this leads us to what was happening with the banks, because they were also involved in a number of iffy or unconventional economic policies and unconventional banking policies. Now, since the 1970s, wages in the United States were really flat. And to compensate for this, many consumers were buying things on credit with very low interest rates, and financial institutions were eager to oblige them. In 2008, in fact, credit card debt in the United States was over $1 trillion, which people used credit cards to basically compensate for the fact that they weren't getting paid very much. Now, the banks during this time were also making high-risk, high-interest mortgage loan, known as subprime mortgages, to consumers who often misunderstood their terms and also lacked the ability to make the payments at all. And you have the name subprime mortgages on the slide in front of you. Now, in the past, the loan givers were very careful to vet the individuals that they gave loans to because they wanted to get the money back. However, changes in the banking laws in the 1990s under the Clinton administration and also in the 2000s under George Bush allowed banks to securitize their mortgage loans and sell them as bonds. Basically what they would do is they would package a lot of loans together, credit card bills, etc., put them into a bond, and then sell them to investors. Now this was very attractive to banks, and once the bonds were purchased, larger investment banks bundled these bonds together into huge packages known as collateralized debt obligations, or CDOs. You have that term on the screen as well. And they sold them to investors around the world. So basically what you have the banks doing is engaging in very iffy activity. They're selling these subprime mortgages to individuals who probably can't pay them back with very high interest rates and high risk. They're then packaging these mortgages into bonds, and the larger investment firms are packaging these bonds into larger packages known as CDOs, and then they were selling them around the world. And it's noteworthy, these also could be insured so that companies didn't lose money. All right, so you could basically ensure that if you bought one of these CDOs, that you would never lose any money. And basically the result of this was a huge housing bubble. Basically, the value of homes rose year after year based on the ease in which people could buy them. And the banks continue to give people these subprime loans in spite of the fact that they couldn't pay them off. And now the whole world is really involved in this because of the CDOs. It's complicated, but this is essentially what caused the Great Recession of 2008. Now, in 2007, the banks crashed when people began defaulting on their loans. And 100 mortgage lenders, or more than 100 mortgage lenders throughout the US, went out of business as a result of this. For example, the first business to go out of, or the first bank to go out of business in September 2008 was Lehman Brothers, which was wiped out completely and really signaled the beginning of the crisis. The group known as the American International Group, or AIG, which was a multinational insurance company, had insured the CGOs and was also extremely hurt by the collapse. And Merrill Lynch, which was another major banking company or investment company, also sold themselves to survive during this crisis. Now, fearing the collapse of the United States economy, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, who was named Ben Bernanke, authorized the bailout of a Wall Street firm known as Bear Stearns during this period. And later on, Congress also followed suit, and they agreed to a $70 billion bailout in federal funds to financial institutions in the United States. After this, they agreed to pass the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act, which created the Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP, and you have that on your slide in front of you. And this also helped to bail out the companies. Now, one key element of the program was the bailout of the automobile industry. Now, Bush responded to the appeal of the automobile industry, which was suffering greatly as a result of this, with an emergency loan of $17.4 billion to stave off the industry's collapse. Ultimately, this prevented another Great Depression. However, the United States still fell into a Great Recession, as did the world economy. The stock prices fell throughout the world, sometimes by as much as 45%. In the last 4 months of 2008, 1 million people lost their jobs in the United States. And in 2009, another 3 million people lost their jobs. So this was an extremely great tragedy for the United States of America. And it was ultimately rooted in the deregulation of the banks, which had happened in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. Now this brings us to the third part of the lecture, which is titled New Century and Old Disputes. And this will basically look at a group of minorities or two groups of minorities which still faced issues of discrimination and racism during this period. Now, this ultimately brings us to the issue of immigration, which was a major point in the time of the Bush administration and beyond. And there's nothing new about anxiety over immigration in the United States. As discussed, it was a problem in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, in the mid 20th century, and even into the late 20th century. There have always been people who worried about who was entering the country and the changes which might result as a result of this. But it really started flaring up again in the 1980s in America, because it was clear that the white majority, because of the influx of Latin Americans in particular, would soon be a demographic minority. So as a result of this, there are movements in the United States to make English the official language of the U.S. because the United States, as of now, has no official language. And this was particularly strong in areas in which many Spanish speakers, such as Arizona, existed and lived. Now, in 2006, 3/4 of Arizona approved a proposition to make English the official language of the state. And the argument was that Hispanic newcomers had not officially acculturated themselves into the white middle-class culture that existed in Arizona. And basically, they wanted to do this. Now, there were a lot of opponents. Some, for example, said that English was already the de facto language of the United States and Arizona in particular, and that codifying this into law would amount to discrimination against Hispanics. So not everyone advocated this, but there were 3/4 of Arizona who did. Now, fear also was shaped by concern that there were too many illegal immigrants from Latin America. And in 2006, what was known as the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act was proposed in Congress to strengthen security along the U.S.-Mexican border and to give long-term residents in the United States the opportunity to become citizens. It also did numerous other things for immigrants and illegal immigrants as well. However, this ultimately failed to become law. And it's noteworthy that after this, other states also continued to pass anti-immigration legislation, which applied to the states alone but weren't applicable on a federal level. For example, Alabama passed laws making it illegal to give undocumented immigrants housing, which really kept immigrants or undocumented immigrants from going to Alabama. In 2010, Arizona also passed a law barring the teaching of any class that promoted resentment in students, particularly with respect to other races, or discouraged what was known as ethnic solidarity. And this really included a popular Mexican American Studies program, which people were worried created hatred towards white students. So it's noteworthy that even today, America still has immigration issues and concerns over the question which is posed here: who is American? Now here's a map which shows the ethnicities as they're distributed. I don't know if you can read it very clearly, but as you can notice, the dark purple, for example, is African American, and these individuals are primarily spread throughout the South. And then you have other ethnic groups as well. The light blue, for example, are people of German descent. Now, another question which dominated the Bush administration and beyond was, what is a marriage? And it's noteworthy that in the 1990s, the ideal or the idea of legal same-sex marriages was really unlikely. A large reason for this was what was known as the Defense of Marriage Act, which was passed in 1996, And this basically defined a marriage as a union between a man and a woman. Now, ultimately, the feeling that marriage applied only to a man and a woman changed when Vermont, in the year 2000, allowed same-sex couples to form civil unions, which would give them all the legal rights and privileges as a marriage. Now, after this, several states followed suit, and in 2004, the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that barring gays and lesbians from marrying actually violated the state constitution. Basically, it said that offering same-sex couples the right to form civil unions but not marry was a form of discrimination, and according to the Constitution, this was not allowed. As a result of this, Massachusetts became the first state to allow same-sex couples to marry, and proponents of this claimed a win for civil rights in particular. Now, it's also noteworthy that there was backlash in other states. In fact, between 1998 and 2012, 30 states actually banned same-sex marriage, either by statute or by amending their state constitutions. Now, some were ultimately unsuccessful in doing this, including Massachusetts, which tried to repeal its 2004 ruling by amending its state constitution and making same-sex marriages illegal once again. However, ultimately, this opened up more doors for gay and lesbian marriages, and it also particularly became open when the U.S. Supreme Court in 2013 said that the Defense of Marriage Act of 1996, which defined marriage as the union of one man and one woman, was unconstitutional, and the rest is history, and gay marriage is now available in a far larger number of states. Now, here are some of the demonstrations relating to gay marriage and traditional marriages. And you can see the proponents of both in these pictures. Now, this ultimately brings us to the last part of this lecture, namely the presidency of Barack Obama, which continues as we speak. And it's noteworthy that when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, American voters had become very tired of the war in Iraq and also the economic turndown. And they elected Barack Obama, who was a relatively newcomer to the political scene because of this. Now, it's noteworthy that Barack Obama was the first African-American nominee for the office of president from either major party, and he ran against John McCain, who was a Republican, had lots of experience, but he was ultimately tied to the war in Iraq, and this hurt his campaign. Now, while McCain was criticized for the war, Obama was criticized for his lack of experience, but he chose an experienced politician as a running mate, namely Joe Biden. And he also offered promises of hope and change, and he was the first president to harness social media for a presidential campaign, which really helped him to win the election. And during the election, he drew out first-time voters and won 95% of the African-American vote and 44% of the white vote by becoming the first African-American president. Now, Obama was elected on the platform of healthcare reform and also a wave of frustration over the sinking economy, which had happened just prior to his election. In 2009, he took over TARP, which we talked about in the previous section, which was set up by Bush to stabilize the financial institutions. And he oversaw the distribution of $1.77 trillion, which was designed to shore up the nation's banking system during this period. He also gave $80 billion to help Chrysler and General Motors, which was controversial but it did help the automakers earn a profit by 2011, and it also prevented layoffs and wage cuts. And both of these institutions, both of these corporations have been able to start paying back the $80 million as of recently. In 2009, Obama also issued the American Recovery Investment Act, or the ARRA, and this pumped $800 billion into the economy to stimulate economic growth and job creation. Now, healthcare, more so than the economy, was very important to Obama supporters. And ultimately, the passing of healthcare reform was not easy for Barack Obama because there was a lot of political wrangling. People saw the healthcare reform plan as a form of socialism, particularly in conservative rings. However, finally, what was known as the Patient Protection and Affordable Health Care Act was passed through Congress and finally signed into law in 2010. This act is better known as Obamacare, and it was the first significant overhaul of the American healthcare system since the passage of Medicaid in 1965 under President Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, the goals of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act were multifaceted. First of all, they wanted to provide all Americans with access to affordable health insurance, and it also required everyone to acquire some form of health insurance, and lastly, it aimed to lower the cost of healthcare for all Americans. Now, discontent over the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, helped the Republicans to capture the majority in the House in the 2010 midterm elections, and it also helped spawn a new party which came to the scene in Washington politics known as the Tea Party, which really focused on limiting government spending and the size of the federal government. Now here is an illustration showing the signing of the Affordable Care Act by President Barack Obama. And this ultimately brings us to the last slide in this lecture, namely Obama's second term after the election of 2012. Now, it's noteworthy that despite the aforementioned, particularly the opposition to the Affordable Care Act, Obama won the 2012 election against Republican candidate Mitt Romney. However, he still faced a number of ongoing challenges, and he still does today. For example, the economy remained stagnant in many areas once he came to power in 2012. On average, American students were still behind their peers in the rest of the world, and President Bush's policies, particularly No Child Left Behind, still had a ways to go. The cost of college education in the United States was still unaffordable to many people, but Obama increased the amount of money that students could receive under the Pell Grant, and he also lowered interest rates on student loans to make university education more available to a wider number of people. There were still problems that continued overseas in both Iraq and Afghanistan. In Iraq, 4,475 American soldiers paid for it with their lives, and 32,220 were wounded. And ultimately, progress in Iraq was hurt by the rise of the Islamic State of Iraq in Syria in June 2014, which continues to be a problem today. In February 2013, in Afghanistan, a total of 2,165 U.S. soldiers had been declared dead, and 18,230 had been wounded. And though in May 2014, Obama announced that for the most part, combatant operations were over, another act of terrorism took place on American soil when bombs exploded in 2013 in the Boston Marathon. So terrorism continues to be an issue in the United States as well. Now, ultimately, the cause of same-sex marriage in the United States also has made significant advancements during the second term of the Obama administration, as has greater protection for the environment. And it's noteworthy that Barack Obama has raised fuel efficiency standards for automobiles during his time as president to reduce emission of greenhouse gases. And he's also required coal-burning power plants to capture their carbon emissions in an attempt to stop global warming as well. And this brings us to the end of this lecture, the final lecture in this series.